prayers rendered in anguish to what we will see today, one of the most beautiful prayers, psalm, song, whatever you want to term it, that we have record of in the Bible. So we're excited about starting in on this one. But before we start, maybe a little review is in order. Back from chapter 2, you may recall that when we started chapter 2, we saw Habakkuk watching and waiting. He said he would, like a watchman, go up into the watchtower and wait for God's answer. And so this, to me, always pointed out something remarkable about the book itself, in that this is a record of a conversation back and forth between Habakkuk and God. And one of the more interesting aspects, I think, that to really fathom that here is one of God's prophets literally having a conversation with the creator of the universe. Just that in and of itself would have been worth reading the book. So, and as he watched and waited on God's answer, of course, that answer came. And God spoke and said, write this down on tablets, tell the people, have it sent out with the heralds. This is important. Here is my answer. And to summarize it, I've listed here, we have that great verse often quoted by Paul and the writer of Hebrews, but the righteous will live by faith. But woe to those who live by theft, greed, violence, injustice, idolatry, extortion, all manner of evil doing, in order to further their lives. And so that's where we spent last week, looking at this answer from God. And you may remember Habakkuk had been, in the first chapter, kind of pleading for God to handle the evil and the injustice that he saw there in Judah. That was Habakkuk's first calamity, and his main concern was what in the opening verses of chapter 1, what was Habakkuk really concerned about? Anybody remember? He was puzzled at why God had been silent, and so he was really asking God, are you listening? Do you not see what is happening? And so that was the initial place that Habakkuk was in. And of course, we know over from chapter 1 that God says, yes, I see all that, and I've got a remedy here, and I'm going to send the Babylonians your way. And after that revelation, Habakkuk's concern now wasn't so much that God was not listening, but that how in the world could God use the Babylonians as part of the solution here? And so that was the shift that Habakkuk had made. And at the end of chapter 1, we find him questioning that. Are you going to continue to let them run over nations and catch us like fish in a net? And so we see this shift in Habakkuk's mindset. And so there in chapter 2, he says, okay, I've done my questioning now. I'm going to go wait for the answer. God gives him the answer and says, have faith. Have faith. I'm not going to let the Babylonians flourish forever, but I'm using them as punishment for Judah. who has fallen away. And so he lists out the properties, the qualities that the Babylonians represented, and on each one said, woe is that, woe is your greed, your violence, your idolatry, and I will turn the tables on you. And we know, of course, that comes about. The Babylonians are thrown from power by the Persians in the future. But for right now, this is God's kind of revelation to Habakkuk in chapter 2. So we end in chapter 2 with this, I think, wonderful capstone that really shows kind of the path that Habakkuk is going along here, where chapter 2 ends with this verse: "The Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth be silent before him." So there's no more questioning that I need to do. I have seen the answer from God. I am relying on that. So I will choose to live by faith because God is over all. Let everything else be silent. So that brings us to today. Any questions, comments before we jump into chapter 3? Anything? No? Okay. Let's roll on then. All right. So here we go in Habakkuk, the first couple of verses, and I will turn it over to the wiser of the two here.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. That certainly was an amazing sermon this morning, and just God is faithful. And now I've got Abraham on the brain, so if I say Abraham instead of Habakkuk, just no, I'm crazy. But let's start in chapter 3. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shinoga, however you say that. Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord. Repeat them in our day, and in our time make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. This is just an awesome beginning to this chapter. It begins with talking about this prayer, this conversation that was so important and so meaningful and had so many nuggets to it that are so important to our lives today. And Habakkuk is calling us to stand in awe of God, to remember his faithfulness. And this was actually supposed to be sung. We won't sing it, but
You're not going to teach us the song?
No.
Okay.
I'll date myself. There used to be an old TV show called Sing Along with Mitch. So we're going to sing along with Habakkuk this morning and go over this conversation that was so meaningful. But he just emphasizes that he stands in awe of God, and to remember this, to not forget about how faithful God is, but to also remember that in discipline, there's also mercy, and that is very important. And I think we start to see a change in perspective of Habakkuk. He knew that God was going to discipline the people of Judah. And it wasn't going to be pleasant. It was going to be hard, but he accepted God's will and he asked for mercy and help. He did the truth, to learn a lesson. And in Hebrews 12, it says, God says, my child, don't make light of the Lord's discipline and don't give up when he corrects you. For the Lord disciplines those he loves and he punishes each one as he accepts it his child. And that is just really comforting and amazing. I'm a sinner. I know when I have sin in my life, I try to rationalize why I did whatever it was that I did. I want to make excuses, but the longer that you do that and you sit in that, you just stay in this state of turmoil. And I try to just immediately go, I was wrong. Please forgive me. I don't want to live this way. And it's so comforting to know that your Father's waiting for you. He's waiting for you to realize that you may have made a mistake and that you come to him for forgiveness. That father-child relationship is very important. And it's very comforting to know that he has mercy for us. He knows that we're going to mess up, and he's waiting with open arms to forgive us. And this is just a very comforting thought.
Yeah, it certainly is. A couple of thoughts that I had here. That last line, in wrath, remember mercy. We're in the middle part of this chapter going to read a lot about God's wrath against the enemy. But I can just picture Habakkuk starting off in this prayer, knowing that violence is to come. There's going to be wrath, both from the Babylonians, right, and then ultimately God's wrath on them. But his plea here to remember mercy. And it reminds me of some of the dialogue that Moses had with God when he would plead for the Israelite nation. And God was ready to, in essence, wipe them out, start over again, which certainly could have been his plan when he saw how faithless this nation was to him. And Moses pleads with God to not do that, but to punish, yes, but not to forget his promise. And so I think this kind of resonates with that. In wrath, remember your mercy. Don't forget your mercy. The other thing in this, in the second verse there, in the NIV, it says, I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord, repeat them in our day. In other words, work now. Let's see that action now. Some translations say revive your work, take action. And one of the commentators that I was reading through on this said, oftentimes today in our prayers, it's revive our work. We want God's blessings for our work. Here, Habakkuk is clear that it's God's work, it's God's plan that he's asking for revival for. But he wants to see it soon in this. So let's push on here. What follows from here through verse 15 is this. It's several things. One, it's a vision that Habakkuk has from God of what his work will be here. And it's also that song that Katie mentioned, that I forget what the word was, something hard to pronounce here. Shigionoth. Not a word we use today in our language. I read was this signified notes from Habakkuk on how this was to be sung. It's with a lot of feeling, not flowing and melodic, but strong and powerful singing. And then toward the end, we're going to see that's done with instruments. And so he wraps this chapter 3 with some directions on how this is to be delivered. Well, I got to thinking, this is a song to be sung. And so what's the point? I'm thinking that Habakkuk is likely giving directions, knowing that the Babylonians are going to come, they're going to capture Judah, take them into exile, that remnant taken into exile is going to need in those 70 years. He doesn't know it's going to be 70 years. Habakkuk doesn't at this point, but he knows that having a song to sing while you're in captivity, basically, can help remind you of better days, of hope, of here's the reason for your faith. And so I think a lot of that is here in this. This wasn't to be sung one time, but rather to be kind of an anthem that in captivity they could rely on to give them daily encouragement there. So let's get into this part. I'll just read through this. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. And then you notice Selah, S-E-L-A-H, there at the end. This was another term. We see it a lot in Psalms. Various Psalms have that notation, Selah, at the end, which means basically to pause and reflect. And so this first phrase, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. Let's stop and think about that, is what Habakkuk is writing here. And so what's the significance here? Well, if we go back and we look back in Deuteronomy, chapter 33, verse 2, we see the same kind of wording. And so Habakkuk is hearkening back to an earlier writing here in Deuteronomy. I'll just read it. I'll read it starting in verse 1. It'll make more sense. This is the blessing that Moses, the man of God, pronounced on the Israelites before his death. Now starting in verse 2. He said, the Lord came from Sinai and dawned over them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran. He came with myriads of holy ones from the south, from his mountain slopes. So this reading in Deuteronomy is describing the event where God comes down to Mount Sinai and assembles Israel before him there for the reading of the law, giving them the law. And it's if you go and read there in earlier in Deuteronomy and then in Exodus before that, talking about the majesty of that event, how when God descended on Mount Sinai, the earth trembled, there was tremendous light, it could be seen far away, and those that weren't of Israel but were, about to be conquered by the Israelites were in fear and dread. This was a mighty presence that God showed there on Mount Sinai, and so we're going to kind of hearken to that in these coming verses, and so that's what Habakkuk is asking them to stop and contemplate: is remember when God shows to you forefathers in that case, and it was so glorious that everybody was afraid. They couldn't bear to look. It was so powerful there. And so this was a hearkening back from Habakkuk about this. Let me continue on. His glory covered the heavens, and his praise filled the earth. His splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hand where his power was hidden. Some of your translations might say horns came from his hand. I won't get into the root word and all like that, but probably the better translation here has to do with light, power flashing from his hand, where his power was hidden. Plague went before him. Pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. The ancient mountain crumbles and age-old hills collapse, but he marches on forever. I saw the tents of Cushan in distress, the dwellings of Midian in anguish. So he's describing these qualities of God when God appears on earth. And not only people are afraid, but the very earth shakes, mountains crumbles. Neighboring lands like Cushan and Midian, who weren't even there, but they feel this power. And so Habakkuk is using in really poetic language here, focusing Judah's focus on the power of God as their Savior. We see Habakkuk giving this poetic revelation to the Judeans. And much of the language here is going to remind them of something that had come before, that is God's deliverance of Israel out of Egypt. And so phrases like plague went before him, pestilence followed his steps. We, of course, easily can transfer that back to the plagues on Egypt, and then the pestilence with the coming of the angel of death there at the end, right before the Exodus. And so this would have resonated easily with the Judeans in that instance. They would have remembered these stories. They would have taken heart in it. So let's move on a little further here. Uh, 8 through 11. Were you angry with the rivers, Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea when you rode, that should be rode, your horses and your chariots to victory? And so Habakkuk is asking the question here, like when you parted the Red Sea, was it because you were angry with the Red Sea? When you divided the River Jordan, to walk across into the Promised Land, was that because you were angry at that river? And of course, the answer is no. It wasn't the sea and the rivers he was angry against. He was angry against injustice, angry against the enemy that was to be destroyed in this case. There in verse 9, you uncovered your bow. In other words, you took it out of its case. You called for many arrows. And there we see Selah again. And I have to think at this point, if you've ever watched a movie where the soundtrack suddenly kind of builds up and then goes silent right before some crescendo. I'm not a big movie goer, but all these hero kind of movies where there comes this climactic battle scene, always the soundtrack plays along with that. And so I'm thinking Habakkuk right here is saying, okay, God has pulled forth his bow and arrows. He is ready to launch the attack. Let's stop and think about the magnitude about what is to happen. And so that's a good spot for a pause there. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. Torrents of water swept by. The deep roared and lifted its waves on high. Sun and moon stood still in the heavens at the glint of your flying arrows, at the lightning of your flashing spear. And so this is the battle ensuing. Okay, here we see action being taken. And of course, we can again look back to the deliverance out of Egypt and see parallels here for crossing of the Red Sea, and then the high priest. We read earlier in Deuteronomy the story of in Exodus the story of Joshua is where it is. The priest taking the Ark of the Covenant, and as soon as their feet touched the waters stopped and parted there on the Jordan River. And so, again, through this poetic language, we see this affirmation of what God will do. And I kind of think Habakkuk in this song is saying, God, we know that you've done this before. We're anticipating you're going to deliver us in this same way again. And so remember the things of the past. In fact, a very wise man this morning, who happens to be in this class, I believe, yes, said, remembering things God has done for us helps us with the future. It helps when the new tests come up. This was a chat post from someone named Paget at 211. I'm not sure who that might have been, but a very wise man. That remembering things that have been done in the past by God helps us as we face things in the future. Now, many commentators will also take this section in this whole chapter in Habakkuk and pitch it forward as to, okay, this is what is being foretold about when Christ comes again, the second coming. And so we won't spend time going through Revelation here, but there is very similar language to describe that John uses in his Revelation to describe the judgment with bowls and riders on horses and such that parallels the language being used here. So many people will take this not only as something contemporary just for Habakkuk speaking to the Judeans, but contemporary for us as a prophecy of God's ultimate victory over evil. And that plays out in these later verses here that we'll get to. I need to leave time for Katie at the end here. So in verses 12 through 15, we see the battle against evil kind of continuing. In wrath, you strode through the earth, and in anger, you threshed the nations. You came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. That could have many meanings. And indeed, some translations say save your anointed ones, plural. But we know that, for instance, Moses was anointed to lead the people out of Egypt. Joshua was anointed to lead them into the promised land. The kings of Israel each were anointed. We know especially Jesus can be referred to as God's anointed one. And so this description, this prophecy could depending upon who the reader is, could point toward deliverance in many instances, in many time frames. I'll continue on. You crushed the leader of the land of wickedness. You stripped him from head to foot. And again, another pause here. So the defeat of all the Canaanites that they had to defeat in order to take the promised land, the defeat of Satan in the end times. All of this could be pointed to in this epic kind of psalm. With his own spear, you pierced his head when his warriors stormed out to scatter us, gloating as though about to devour the wretched who were in hiding. You trampled the sea with your horses, churning the great waters. So these verses from 3 through 15, again, just really a poetic but mighty description of God's power and his wrath against evil, while delivering and providing deliverance to his people, and in very, very, very poetic kinds of terms. And I can just picture the Judeans when they first saw this written on the tablets, it encouraging them in their despair of what was to come. Still they had encouragement and faith that God would continue to be faithful. So, enough of me here. To the last verses.
Okay. So after hearing all this, this was a lot to take in, and very descriptive. So in verse 16, it says, I hear and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones and my legs trembled. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nations invading us. Habakkuk's scared. I would be. I mean, this is quite a lot to take in that is going to happen. And so it's just, his heart is pounding. You can almost just feel that as Don was going through all of this. And in verse 17, it says, though the fig tree does not bud and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls. He's talking about if all this happens, if there's no food, there's no animals to slaughter for food. They can't go to the grocery store. They can't go to the farmer's market. There's nowhere to go. They have to totally depend on God for help. And this just shows us how much we need to depend on God to be our Savior, to be our provider. If all these things happen, we know we can still depend on you. We have to receive our discipline and we have to learn from it and move on. But we have to know that God is sovereign and that he will provide and he will protect. And verse 18 is very important. This is like the theme verse of all of this. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. That is so powerful. It's like no matter what happens, I will continue to praise you. I will continue to rejoice in you. I know that you will take care of me and you will deliver me. And in verse 19, it says, the sovereign Lord is my strength. He will make my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on heights. It's just like when you think about how a deer running through a field is very light on his feet and almost joyful. And that's how he wants us to be, that even in hard times, like we're going through now, we can still be joyful. And that's hard to do. So how are some of the ways that maybe you have come to during this time of all this oppressive news and you just think this is just never going to end? How do you turn that around and be joyful? What are some of the ways that maybe you have let this manifest in your daily life?